"Don't pay me," she said, when the auctioneer called her name like she was a heifer up for bid. "Just give my brother food." The crowd laughed. Not all of them, but enough. Enough that the sound rolled across the dust like a wave breaking over dry stone. And Cole Hastings felt his jaw tighten before he'd even decided to feel anything at all. The girl stood on the flatbed wagon they dragged into the square, hands bound loosely at the wrist with a strip of rawhide, more for show than for holding. Her dress had been patched so many times it looked stitched from a dozen different lives. Dust clung to the hollows of her collarbones. Her hair, the color of scorched wheat, had come loose from its braid and hung in her face, and still she didn't look down. Still she looked out over the crowd like she was daring one of them to meet her eyes and hold there. Behind her, half hidden by the wagon's slat rail, a boy no older than 8 sat with his knees pulled to his chest. His cheeks were sunken in a way that no 8-year-old's cheeks should be. His lips were cracked. He didn't cry. He'd learned, somewhere along the road that brought them here, that crying didn't fill a stomach. "Working contract," the auctioneer called out. A heavy-set man named Purdy with tobacco-stained teeth and a voice built for selling cattle. 2 years labor, kitchen and field. Girls able-bodied. Strong back. "Do I hear $1?" Cole had come to Larkspur Crossing to buy seed corn and a plow blade. Nothing more. He hadn't planned on standing in a dust-choked square listening to a man auction off a girl like she was livestock, using the polite word contract to dress up what everybody in that crowd knew was closer to bondage. Debt bond auctions had crept into the territory the last 2 years. Ever since the drought turned honest people desperate and men like Dutch Colby turned desperation into profit. Colby owned the bank, the feed store, and, from where Cole stood, apparently now the auctioneer's tongue as well. "Dollar," someone called. A rancher's wife, maybe, looking for cheap kitchen help. "$1.50, said another voice, harder, and Cole recognized it. Silas Rourke, Colby's foreman. A man with a reputation for using his belt on more than horses. Something in the girl's shoulders went rigid at the sound of that name. Cole didn't decide to raise his hand. His body did it before his mind caught up, the way it sometimes did when a rattler struck at a horse's leg and his arm was already moving to yank the reins before he registered the danger. $2, he said. Purdy blinked. Rourke turned, slow, like a man who wasn't used to being outbid by nobodies. That building a habit. Hastings? Buying things you got no use for? $2 stands, Cole said. He didn't raise his voice. He'd learned a long time ago that a quiet voice carried further in a crowd than a loud one, because it made people lean in to hear what came next, and what came next mattered. Rourke's eyes narrowed, doing the arithmetic of whether this was worth a fight in front of half the county. He must have decided it wasn't, because he spat near his own boot and turned away, muttering something about Colby not forgetting. Sold, Purdy said, sounding almost disappointed, for $2 to Cole Hastings. The crowd's attention moved on the way crowds do, already drifting toward the horse pens and the smell of frying dough from the church lady's stand. Cole crossed the square, boots kicking up little clouds of pale dust, and stopped at the base of the wagon. Up close, the girl was younger than he'd guessed from a distance, 19, maybe 20, but her eyes were older than that, the kind of old that came from watching people you loved go hungry and being able to do nothing but stand between them and the worst of it. She looked at the $2 silver Purdy was already pocketing, then at Cole, and something in her face braced itself, like she expected him to name a price now that the crowd wasn't watching. I don't need a field hand, Cole said, and I sure as hell don't need a contract. Her chin lifted a fraction. Then why'd you pay for me? Cole looked past her, at the boy still curled against the wagon slats, watching this stranger with the flat, careful eyes of a child who has learned that grown men are rarely good news. I didn't pay for you, Cole said. I paid Purdy $2 to shut his mouth and let you two walk off this wagon like people instead of property. Far as I'm concerned, that contract's kindling. The girl's breath caught. For a moment the hard mask she'd built cracked clean down the middle, and underneath it was just exhaustion and disbelief, and something that might have been the first sting of tears she hadn't let herself cry in weeks. You mean that? She whispered. I don't say things I don't mean, Cole said. Name's Cole Hastings. I've got a ranch 6 miles west, more empty rooms than I know what to do with, and a kitchen nobody's cooked a decent meal in since my mother passed. Your brother looks like he hasn't eaten proper in a week. For days, the girl admitted, and her voice broke on the number, like saying it out loud made it heavier than carrying it silently ever had. We ran out of flour 4 days back. I've been giving him what I could find. Roots. A rabbit Sam trapped Tuesday. What's your name? Cole asked. Mercy, she said. Mercy Calloway. That's my brother, Sam. Mercy. Cole repeated, and something about the words settled into him strange and warm, like a coal catching. Well, Mercy Calloway, you and Sam are welcome at my table tonight. No contract, no labor owed. Just supper and a roof, and we'll figure the rest out come morning. He held up a hand to help her down off the wagon. She stared at it a long moment, like she was trying to work out the trick in it, the hidden cost, the place where his kindness would suddenly reveal its teeth, because in her experience, and she was young enough that her experience should not have taught her this yet, kindness always had teeth eventually. But her brother was hungry, and the sun was dropping toward the ridgeline, and she was tired in a way that went bone deep. So she took Cole's hand. Behind them, across the square, Silas Rourke stood in the shade of the feed store awning, watching, his expression unreadable, already turning the scene over in his mind the way a man turns over a coin he intends to spend on something ugly. The ride out to the Hastings Ranch took the better part of an hour, the wagon wheels grinding over rutted road while the last of the daylight burned copper along the western hills. Sam fell asleep against his sister's shoulder within the first mile, worn thin as old rope, and Mercy sat with her arm curled protectively around him the whole way, watching Cole from the corner of her eye like she still hadn't decided whether to trust the ground beneath her feet. You don't have to do that, she said finally, when the silence had stretched long enough that it seemed safer to break it than to keep carrying it. Do what? Watch the road so hard. I know how this looks. Man buys a girl at an auction, brings her home. Her voice had an edge to it, brittle as dry leather. I've heard the stories. I know what men expect when they pay for something, even when they call it kindness. Cole didn't answer right away. He kept the horses at a steady walk, letting the question sit in the air between them the way he'd let a spooked colt sit with a saddle blanket before ever reaching for the cinch. My mother used to say a man's worth isn't in what he takes, he said at last. It's in what he's willing to give up and expect nothing back for. I paid $2 to stop a wrong I couldn't unsee happening in front of me. That's the whole of it. You want to leave come morning, nobody's stopping you. There's no debt here, Mercy. Not to me, not to anybody. She studied him a long moment, and something in her shoulders loosened by a fraction. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of a question mark where before there had only been a locked door. Why'd you really do it? She asked. Truly. Men don't spend money and expect nothing for it. Not out here. Cole's hands tightened, just slightly, on the reins. Because 6 years back, during the war, I watched men get bought and sold and traded like they were nothing but muscle and sweat, and I swore if I ever had the chance to stop it happening in front of me, I would. I don't always get that chance. Today I did. It was the most he'd said about the war to a stranger in longer than he could remember, and the words felt strange in his mouth, like a door he'd nailed shut coming loose at the hinges. Mercy didn't press further. She'd learned, in her own hard years, when a person had given you all the truth they had room to give. They reached the ranch as the sky was purpling toward true dark. The house was modest but solid, hewn timber, a wide porch, smoke already curling from a neighbor's distant chimney reminding Cole he'd need to light his own stove. He carried Sam inside himself, the boy barely stirring, light as a bundle of kindling in his arms, and laid him on the bed in the spare room while Mercy hovered in the doorway like she expected to be told this was all a mistake. There's cornmeal in the pantry, salt pork hanging in the smokehouse, and eggs the hens laid this morning that I never got around to collecting, Cole said. Kitchen's yours if you want it. I'll see to the horses. You're just going to leave me alone in your house? Mercy asked, and there was real bewilderment in it, like the offer didn't compute against anything she understood about how the world worked. It's your house tonight too, Cole said simply, and went out to the barn before she could answer, because some kindnesses landed better without an audience to receive the thanks for them. By the time he came back in, the kitchen smelled of frying salt pork and cornbread rising in the Dutch oven. and Mercy had scrubbed the table down to bare wood and lit every lamp in the room like she was trying to chase the last of the auction dust out of the corners. Sam was awake now, sitting up at the table, watching the skillet with the fierce, wordless hunger of a child who has learned not to ask for food out loud in case asking made it disappear. They ate in near silence, but it was a different silence than the wagon ride, warmer, thicker, full instead of empty. Sam ate like he was afraid the plate would be taken from him, until Mercy laid a gentle hand over his and said, "Slow down, Sammy. Nobody's taking it away," and the boy's shoulders came down from around his ears for what looked like the first time in days. It was near midnight when the hoofbeats came. Cole heard them first, 3 horses, maybe 4, moving at a hard trot up the ranch road, not the gait of a friendly visit. He was on his feet and reaching for the rifle above the door before Mercy had even registered the sound, but she registered it fast enough after that, her face going the color of ash. "That's them," she said. "That's Rourke's men. They found where you took us." "They've got no claim on you," Cole said, checking the rifle's action with hands that had gone steady the way they always did when trouble arrived. The shaking saved for after, if there was an after. "Purdy sold the contract, and I burned it. It's ash in my hearth right now." "Dutch Colby doesn't care what's legal," Mercy said, and her voice had dropped to something low and urgent, the voice of someone who had learned this lesson at terrible cost. "He cares what he wants. And what he wants is Sam and me back on that wagon, or worse. He wants everybody in this county to see what happens to a man fool enough to cross him." The hoofbeats grew louder. Through the window, Cole could see torchlight bobbing along the ranch road, 3 riders and a 4th trailing behind, and even in the dark he recognized the wide shoulders and slow, deliberate posture of Silas Rourke at the front of them. "Get your brother into the root cellar," Cole said, voice flat and quiet in the way that meant he'd already decided what came next. "Bar the door from the inside. Whatever you hear, you don't come out till I call for you by name. Cole, go." "Mercy." For a moment she hesitated, some instinct in her rebelling against being hidden away while someone else stood between her and danger. She had spent years being the one who stood in front of Sam, not the one tucked behind a locked door, but the boy's hand found hers, small and trembling, and that decided it. She pulled Sam toward the cellar stairs, casting one last look back at Cole standing in the lamplight with the rifle steady in his hands. His jaw set like a man who had made peace with a decision the moment he'd raised his hand in that dusty square and said, $2. The riders were close enough now that Cole could hear Rourke's low laugh carrying over the thunder of hooves, the sound of a man who believed the night's outcome was already decided in his favor. Cole blew out the lamp and stepped out onto the porch to meet them in the dark. The torchlight found him first. 4 riders reining up at the edge of the yard, their horses blowing hard, flanks lathered from the ride. Silas Rourke sat forward in the saddle, torch held high enough to throw his face into sharp orange relief, and behind him 3 of Colby's hired men fanned out slow and deliberate, the practiced spread of men who had done this kind of work before and knew how to make a single house feel surrounded. "Evening, Hastings," Rourke said, all easy menace, like they were meeting over cards instead of at midnight with rifles half-raised. "Heard you took in some strays today." "Heard wrong," Cole said. "I bought $2 worth of freedom off Purdy's wagon and let it walk off free. Ain't nothing here belongs to Dutch Colby." "See, that's where you're mistaken." Rourke swung down off his horse with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once lost a fight he'd started. "That girl's father owed Mr. Colby a debt going back 3 winters. Died owing it. Debt don't die with a man out here, Hastings. It passes down. That girl and her brother are collateral, same as a horse or a wagon. Purdy had no right selling what wasn't his to sell." "Then take it up with Purdy," Cole said. "Wagon's ash. Contract's burned. You want to argue law with me, go fetch a judge from the county seat. Otherwise, you're 4 men trespassing on my land at midnight, and I've got a rifle that says that's the last mistake you make tonight." Rourke's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes went cold and flat. "You always were sentimental, Hastings. Same as your daddy. Sentimental men don't last long out here. Ground's littered with their bones." He gestured, small and casual, and the 3 riders behind him spread wider, one moving toward the barn, one circling toward the side of the house, the 3rd staying mounted with a rifle laid loose across his saddle horn, pointed at nothing in particular and everything at once. Last chance, Rourke said. Send the girl and the boy out and we ride off peaceful, and this stays a disagreement between reasonable men. Refuse and Mr. Colby's going to want to know why his property's being harbored by a man who thinks $2 buys him the right to make enemies of the whole county. Cole's finger found the trigger guard, not the trigger. Not yet, but close enough that Rourke would see the readiness in it. Get off my land. What happened next happened fast, the way violence always did. No slow build, no warning shot, just the man near the barn suddenly lunging for the door, maybe hoping to spook the horses into chaos, and Cole's rifle swinging toward him on instinct, and Rourke's hand dropping for his own sidearm in the same heartbeat. The shot that cracked the night came from the mounted rifleman. A warning meant for the sky, or maybe not a warning at all, hard to say in the confusion. And Cole felt the wind of it pass close enough to stir his hair before it splintered the porch post behind him. He didn't think. He fired back, aiming low and wide, taking the rifleman's horse out from under him rather than the man himself, because even now, even with his own life on the scales, Cole Hastings could not make himself the kind of man who killed easy. The horse screamed and reared, throwing its rider hard into the dirt. Chaos broke loose across the yard, Rourke's pistol clearing leather, the man near the barn wheeling back toward the porch, and Cole diving sideways off the steps as a second shot chewed splinters from the doorframe where his head had been a half-second before. From the root cellar came a muffled cry. Sam, terrified, the sound cutting through Cole's chest sharper than any bullet. And he heard Mercy's voice, low and fierce, hushing the boy, holding the line Cole had asked her to hold even as the world outside came apart in gunfire and screaming horses. Cole rolled behind the water trough, rifle up, and found Rourke advancing across the yard with his pistol raised, torchlight throwing his shadow long and monstrous across the packed earth. There was no cover between them now, nothing but 10 yards of open ground and a decision that had to be made in less time than it took to draw a full breath. You could have just given her back, Rourke called out, and there was something almost regretful under the menace now, the tone of a man who took no particular joy in what he was about to do but would do it anyway because that was the job. Now Colby's going to want this place burned to the foundation, same as we did the Whitfield spread last spring. Same as we'll do to anybody fool enough to think $2 buys them out from under him. The Whitfield spread. Cole's stomach turned cold. He'd heard the rumors. A family burned out, driven off their land, the fire blamed on a lightning strike nobody who'd seen the char marks believed for a second. Now he understood, with sudden and terrible clarity, exactly what kind of man Dutch Colby was, and exactly what kind of fate he'd invited onto his own land the moment he'd raised his hand in that auction square. Rourke's boot found the bottom porch step. Cole's finger found the trigger. And then, from the darkness beyond the barn, a fifth rider burst into the torchlight at a dead gallop. Not one of Colby's men, but a stranger, hat low, rifle already up, and the shot that rang out came from a direction none of them expected, taking Rourke's pistol clean out of his hand in a spray of splintered wood and torn leather. Rourke staggered back, cursing, cradling his ruined hand, and in the confusion that followed, horses screaming, the newcomer's rifle swinging to cover the remaining men. Cole surging up from behind the trough with his own weapon leveled. The balance of the fight tipped, sudden and complete, from 4 against 1 to something far less certain. That's enough, the stranger said, reining his lathered horse to a stop between Cole and Rourke, rifle steady on the wounded foreman's chest. Tell Colby the Calloway debt died with their father, same as the law says it should. Tell him Marshal Ezra Kane rode out to see it enforced personal, and tell him if I hear one more word about a burned ranch in this county, I'm riding straight to the territorial governor with paper on every acre he's stolen since the drought started. Rourke's face, lit orange and furious in the guttering torchlight, cycled through rage, calculation, and finally a bitter, grudging retreat. He spat blood from a split lip Cole didn't remember landing, and gathered his men with a jerk of his good hand. This ain't finished, Hastings, he said, swinging painfully back into his saddle. It is tonight, Cole said, rifle steady until the last hoofbeat faded into the dark. The marshal introduced himself properly once the yard had gone quiet again. Ezra Kane, gray at the temples, a face carved by 20 years of riding hard roads, and a badge that had seen more use in forcing paper than pulling triggers, though tonight had clearly been an exception. He'd been 3 days behind Rourke's trail already, he explained, following whispers of the Whitfield fire and half a dozen other accidents that had a way of happening to families who owed Dutch Colby money and had land he wanted. You did a brave thing today, buying that girl free, Kane said, swinging down to check on the wounded horse, gentling it with a low, practiced murmur. Foolish, maybe, but brave. Didn't feel like a choice, Cole admitted. Felt like the only thing I could live with. That's usually how the right choices feel, Kane said, and there was something almost tired in it, the wisdom of a man who'd watched too many people choose the easy wrong thing instead. He accepted Cole's offer of coffee and a place to rest his horse before riding on at first light, and the yard slowly settled back into the ordinary sounds of night. Crickets whined through the cottonwoods, the distant complaint of a disturbed owl. It was Cole who went to the root cellar door and called Mercy's name, soft, the way he'd promised. The door came open a crack first, then wide, and Mercy emerged with Sam clinging to her side, both of them pale and shaking but whole. Her eyes swept the yard, the scorch marks, the trampled dirt, Cole's torn shirt sleeve where a splinter had caught him. Cataloging the damage with the quick, practiced eye of someone used to assessing what a night of violence had cost. "You're hurt," she said, crossing to him before he could answer, her fingers finding the shallow cut along his forearm with a gentleness that surprised them both. "Just a scratch," Cole said. "Splinter, not a bullet. We're all still standing. That's what matters." Mercy didn't let go of his arm right away. In the lantern light spilling from the open door, Cole could see the tremor still running through her, the aftershock of terror not yet fully drained away, and something in him ached at the sight of it. Not pity, exactly, but a fierce, protective wish that she never again have to know a night like this one. "You could have sent us out," she said quietly. "When Rourke gave you the choice, nobody would have blamed you. We're strangers. We're nothing to you." "You're not nothing," Cole said, and the words came out rougher than he intended, worn raw by everything the night had put him through. "You sat on that wagon and looked at every person in that square like you'd rather die than let them see you break. That's not nothing, Mercy. That's the kind of thing a man doesn't turn his back on, whatever it costs him." Her eyes glistened in the lamplight, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence carrying more than words could have managed. Then she reached into the collar of her dress and drew out a small object on a leather cord, a carved wooden bird, rough-hewn but lovingly made, wings spread as if caught mid-flight. "My father carved this," she said, "before he got sick. Before the debt, before any of it. He used to say a wren doesn't need a big cage to know it's still a cage. It just needs the door held shut. He wanted Sam and me to remember that freedom wasn't about how comfortable your cage was. It was about whether the door opened or not." She pressed the carving into Cole's palm, closing his fingers around it before he could protest. "You opened the door today. I want you to have this. Mercy, I can't take something that belonged to your father. You can," she said, firm now, some of her old steel returning to her voice, "because it means more to me knowing it's with someone who understood what it stood for than it would sitting in a pocket. Just a memory of a man who died owing a debt he never should have owed. Take it, Cole. Please." He closed his hand around the small carved bird, its edges worn smooth from years of handling, and felt the weight of what she was giving him settle somewhere deep in his chest. Sam, quiet through all of this, finally spoke. His voice small but steady in a way it hadn't been all night. "Are we gonna have to leave, now that the bad men know where we are?" Cole crouched down to the boy's level, the way he might gentle a spooked colt, meeting him eye to eye. "You let me and the marshal worry about the bad men, Sam. You've got a bed here as long as you need it. Long as you and your sister want it, this is home now. No contract, no debt owed. Just a roof and a table and people who'd rather see you fed than see you sold." Sam's face did something complicated then. Disbelief fighting with a hope he'd clearly trained himself not to feel too easily. The way a burned hand learns to flinch from every flame. But slowly, watching Cole's steady, unhurried expression, the disbelief lost ground, and something like a smile broke through, small and cracked but real. "Marshal Kane," Mercy said, turning to where the older man stood near the porch, quietly giving them their moment. "Rourke said this isn't finished. What happens now? To us, to Cole, to this ranch?" Kane's expression turned grave, but there was steel in it too. The steel of a man who had finally found the leverage he'd been hunting for 3 days on a hard trail. Now I ride into town at first light with a signed statement from every man in this yard, including yours, young lady, about what Silas Rourke and Dutch Colby's operation really is. I've suspected the shape of it for a year. Debt bonds dressed up as legal contracts. Families burned off land they'd already paid for twice over. Tonight I've got a witness, a wounded foreman who fled the scene, and a rancher willing to swear to all of it in front of a territorial judge. Colby's been careful. But careful men still leave tracks when they're desperate enough, and tonight he got desperate. And if he comes back before the judge arrives? Cole asked. Then he'll find this ranch isn't standing alone anymore. Kane said. I'll have 2 deputies riding out from the county seat by tomorrow noon. Colby's reign in this territory is closer to its end than he knows. Hastings. What you did today, buying that girl's freedom for $2 in front of half the county. That's the kind of story that spreads faster than any newspaper. Men like Colby depend on folks staying quiet, staying scared. You just gave this county a reason to stop being scared. The night settled around them then, no longer heavy with threat, but with something gentler. Exhaustion, relief, the fragile beginnings of trust taking root where fear had lived only hours before. Mercy looked at the carved wren still cradled in Cole's palm, at her brother's small, tentative smile, at the man who had spent $2 and very nearly his life to give them both a door instead of a cage. Whatever tomorrow brought, tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Mercy Calloway let herself believe that the worst of the road behind them might finally be over. Dutch Colby did not come at first light, nor at noon, nor even by the time the sun had climbed high and hot over Larkspur Crossing 3 days later. What came instead was worse for him in its way and better for everyone else. A wagon bearing the territorial judge, 2 armed deputies, and a stack of paperwork that Marshal Kane had spent 3 sleepless nights assembling from bank ledgers, burned deeds, and the sworn statements of half a dozen families who had been too frightened to speak until they learned that somebody finally had. Cole rode into town that morning with Mercy and Sam beside him, not because the law required it, but because Mercy had insisted on standing in that square one more time, not as property on a wagon, but as a witness with her chin held high and her voice steady, telling the judge exactly what her father's debt had really been, and exactly what Silas Rourke had threatened to do to a rancher's home over it. Dutch Colby arrived at his own bank that morning to find deputies waiting on his porch and half the county gathered in the street to watch. He was a smaller man than Cole had expected, silver-haired and soft-handed, the kind of man who built his cruelty on paperwork and other men's fists rather than his own. And when the judge read the charges, fraudulent debt bonds, extortion, arson in the matter of the Whitfield Ranch, something in Colby's face collapsed inward, the practiced confidence of a man who had never once expected the ground beneath him to give way. Silas Rourke, his gun hand still bandaged, offered testimony against his employer before the day was through, trading Colby's freedom for a lighter sentence of his own, the kind of betrayal that surprised no one who'd watched him operate, and satisfied no one either, though it sealed the case beyond any doubt. By sundown, Dutch Colby was in the territorial jail awaiting transport to stand trial at the county seat. His bank placed under a receiver's oversight, and every debt bond he'd ever forced onto a desperate family declared void by judicial order, including, first and loudest among them, the Calloway debt that had nearly cost a girl her freedom and a boy his life. The town didn't erupt into celebration exactly. Larkspur Crossing wasn't built for spectacle. But something in it loosened, the way a held breath finally lets go. Families who had lived for years under the shadow of Colby's ledgers began, quietly, to speak of rebuilding, of planting again without fear of the harvest being seized to cover some manufactured debt. The Whitfield family, it turned out, had a cousin 2 counties over willing to help them start fresh, and Mercy made a point of writing to them once she learned their story. 2 strangers bound now by the same kind of fire. Cole Hastings, for his part, went back to being what he'd always been. A rancher with more empty rooms than he knew what to do with, except now the rooms weren't empty anymore. Autumn came slow and gold across the ranch that year, the drought finally breaking in a run of soft rains that turned the brown hills faintly green again. Sam grew steadier by the week, the hollows in his cheeks filling out, his laughter rare and precious at first, becoming something Cole heard daily, echoing from the barn where the boy had taken to following Cole's every chore like a shadow, learning to mend fence and gentle horses with the quiet seriousness of a child determined never to feel helpless again. Mercy stayed too, though nobody ever called it a contract and nobody ever needed to. She ran the kitchen like she'd been born to it, planted a garden along the south fence line, and slowly, over weeks that stretched into months, the careful distance she'd kept around her heart began to soften into something neither of them rushed to name, though everyone in Larkspur Crossing who watched them together at the harvest social that October seemed to already know what it was. "You still carry it?" Mercy asked him one evening in late October, finding him on the porch with the carved wren turning slow between his fingers, catching the last amber light of sunset. "Every day," Cole said. "Figure a door held open is worth remembering, so a man doesn't forget to keep holding it." Mercy sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, and for a long while neither of them said anything more, watching the light fade gold and then rose and then violet over the western ridge, Sam's laughter drifting faint from the barn where he was teaching himself, badly and joyfully, to whistle. "My father used to say something else about that wren," Mercy said finally. "He said a bird that's been caged learns to test every open door twice before it believes the door's really open. I've been testing this one a long while now, Cole Hastings." "And?" Cole asked, though something in his chest already knew the answer, warm and certain as the last light on the hills. "And I think," Mercy said, "I'm finally ready to stop testing and just fly." Years later, when Sam Calloway had grown into a rancher himself, with a spread of his own bordering the Hastings land and a wife who liked to say she'd married into the most stubborn family in the territory, he would tell his own children the story of the auction, of a sister who begged for bread instead of freedom, and a stranger who gave them both without ever once naming a price. The old carved wren still hung above the mantel in the Hastings ranch house, its wings worn smooth from decades of hands that reached up to touch it on their way past. A reminder, Cole liked to say, that the truest kind of wealth a man could hold wasn't measured in dollars paid, but in doors held open long enough for someone else to walk through free. And when travelers passed along the Larkspur Road and asked about the ranch with the wren carved into the gatepost, the old-timers in town would tell them, with a knowing smile, that it all started the day a cowboy paid $2 for a girl's freedom, and got, in the years that followed, everything else besides.